1 year after his election as king was enough for Totila to conquer the entire north of Italy. Already in the spring of 542nd year warlike Goths, seized by enthusiasm, spread across Italy, bypassing major nodes of resistance to the empire and reconquering the provinces. And they surrendered to the barbarians with great willingness, putting at their disposal taxes and new men for the army. The young king spared the farmers, in stark contrast to the Greek officials who greedily sucked out of the cities and lands everything they could reach. The Goths increased their numbers by freeing slaves and colonists, and in the future, during their resistance, they would almost completely rid all of Italy of its slave population. The Italians had already seen their levity in a few years when they welcomed the change from the rule of the Goths to that of the despotic Byzantines. Alexander, an official devoid of conscience, not only siphoned off the wealth of the locals, but also reduced the salaries of his troops and subordinates, which earned him the nickname Solidian. Scissors used to cut off the edges of gold coins, reducing their weight. Similar was the chief of Rome, Vessus. Needless to say, under him the distribution of bread, an old imperial tradition of Rome, which was revived with Theodoric the Great, was completely stopped. Justinian, by the way, approved this order. The possession of Rome he considered not as the return of the capital, but as the possession of the name itself, no longer caring at all about the state of the symbol that once gave the name of the empire. The Roman Pope, who was now appointed as an official, was summoned to Constantinople. He dared to continue the ancient tradition of the popes and did not cancel the edicts issued by his predecessors, did not give up the privileges acquired earlier Rome. Pope Vigilius was taken and forcibly put on the ship, which took him to the court of the emperor. True to the capital, Vigilius did not reach the capital, delayed in Sicily, where his church owned vast estates. Thus, in Italy there remained no powerful defender of interests of people or empire. Commanders of separate garrisons defended their cities, and the countryside without a fight completely passed back into the hands of the Ostrogoths. Byzantine mercenaries moved in droves to the Goths, where they began to receive both pay and food again. Taking advantage of the complete paralysis of the leadership of the enemy, the barbarians could afford to send separate detachments in remote corners of Italy, and those nowhere met with resistance. Totila himself passed Rome, leaving it for later, and broke into central and southern Italy. Benevento, a major city in the center of Italy, was taken by the first attack. Following it, the king of the Goths laid siege to Naples. It should also be noted that the Goths decided to tear down the city walls in all the cities they controlled. Logic was simple. Demoralized army of Byzantium lost to barbarians in the field, but could long and successfully defend behind walls, storming which Goths did not know how. To local inhabitants, Totila explained everything very simply. As they themselves did not fight, absence of walls went only for their benefit. The maximum danger for the simple person in those years was to be inside the besieged city. And so, neither Goths nor Byzantines outside the battles were not going to kill or rob the population. A logical, witty, and man-loving decision. Justinian sent out a new army to fight the Goths, but its commander moved very slowly and indecisively. When they reached Sicily, the Greeks again froze, divided the army and the fleet, which both moved nowhere. The bread collected from the funds of the church, together with the fleet of Greeks, attempted to bring reinforcements to the besieged and suffering Naples. Alas, a storm upset the plans of the volunteers, and the ships washed ashore right up to the camp of the Goths, who took possession of all the goods. Nevertheless, this case forced Totila to think, and the Goths were concerned about creating their own fleet. In general, the actions of Totila radically differ from the formidable but clumsy tactics of his predecessor Vitiges. It was for his clumsiness and surrender of territories Vitiges received the rank of patrician and lived now somewhere in Asia Minor. Totila, on the other hand, attacked, defeated, and acted always as inconveniently as possible for the Greeks. Conon, the defender of Naples, his soldiers and citizens soon saw among the besiegers captured Greeks from the promised help and completely lost heart. They agreed to wait for help from the empire for another 3 months, which Totila nobly gave them, but soon, driven by hunger, could not stand and simply opened the gates without a fight. Leaving the inhabitants of Naples to tear down the walls of their city and praise the Goths for their mercy, the army of the Goths appeared under the walls of Rome. It was the year 544. In the same year, Belisarius was hurried to the aid of his distressed troops from the east. The commander arrived in Ravenna, where he quickly assessed the state of affairs. In fact, the army, which he left in Italy, was completely morally decayed and unfit. Small combat-ready garrisons were sitting around coastal fortresses under siege. Belisarius began to write to the empire, demanding to send him troops. He simply had nothing to campaign against the Ostrogoths. Totila, well aware of insignificance of forces at the rival, has encircled Rome and has blocked ways of delivery to it of provisions and reinforcements. Itself began to take small fortifications of Greeks in vicinities. With inhabitants of subdued cities, Goths did differently. Walls were not spared anywhere. Rome was defended by the garrison of Vessus. Soon to it the first reinforcements from Belisarii, Persian artificer and Thracian barbarian, with strict instructions in any case not to make forays out of the city, broke through. Meanwhile, when the Goths reappeared near Rome, our heroes rushed at them and suffered a crushing defeat. The second siege of Rome, Goths, strikingly different from the siege of Vitiges, when a huge army of Goths non-stop went to the attacks of the city. Totila conducted the siege with great calmness and prudence, and in addition continued to conduct operations in Emilia with his detachments. The citizens, meanwhile, were experiencing greater and greater inconveniences. Vessus earned his money by trading in bread supplies, so that the poor quickly turned to killing dogs, rats, and crows. Leaving Rome was forbidden to the inhabitants. Finally, Belisarius, cursing his fate, which before his eyes was destroying in Italy his glory as a commander, was able to gather new reinforcements, and two of his generals, Valentinian and Phocas, arrived at the mouth of the Tiber to strengthen the defenses and bring supplies of bread to Rome. The fortress of Porto was still holding out, benefiting from sea supplies, but between Porto and Rome the Goths had blocked the road with a camp. Valentine and Phocas contacted Vessus and told him that a joint attack on the Goth camp would clear their way into the city. Vessus did nothing, and soon another army of Belisarius was defeated and fled without accomplishing its task. In the absence of the Pope, his affairs were temporarily managed by the deacon Pelagius. As in the days of the Vandals, like Pope Leo, he left the city and went to Totila, was received, and listened to the king's three conditions. First, Totila was not going to forgive the Sicilians, who were the first to embrace the Byzantines and were still their main base for invading Italy. Second, he was not going to spare the walls of Rome. Thirdly, there was no question of returning the slaves, who had been freed en masse by the Ostrogoths, recruiting them for their troops. Sighing, Pelagius returned to Rome, but no terms of surrender of the city were not interested in greedy Vessus. By this time, the inhabitants of the city had already run out of gold, and Vessus sold bread exclusively to the rich for expensive dishes and articles of precious metals. Soon he had only the bread that the city's chief had left for himself. Then the inhabitants switched entirely to grass and nettles. Starvation deaths and suicides became more frequent, and then it happened. Vessus finally allowed the civilians to leave Rome, upon payment of a sum of money. Unfortunately, the unfortunate fugitives were expected to be devastated by barbarians, as well as death by barbarians, who by this time had ceased to be ceremonious with the descendants of the great Latins. The troubles of the empire did not cease. In Africa, which was hard hit by the plague epidemic, the Berber kingdoms revolted. In the battle with them was defeated and killed the master of the army Solomon. Instead of giving reinforcements, Africa itself asked for more troops to defend the newly acquired lands Belisarius. Finally, Belisarius and the next army he had assembled to lift the siege of Rome arrived in Porto. For the first time in the entire war, Totila endured a brutal battle when Belisarius' troops almost made it to Rome, but retreated because of the danger of a blow to their base, Porto. At the crucial moment came the news of the death of the general who commanded the defense of this city, and Belisarius, worried about the treasury, family, and provisions, in a hurry retreated, although his army had almost taken possession of the wooden fortifications, which the Ostgoths blocked the stone road and the Tiber River. On coming back, Belisarius was astonished to find that the news of the capture of Porto was false, and that his commander Isaac had been killed in an unauthorized sortie. Here, at this point, our hero's health was failing. He lay dying at Porto. In the camp of the Goths still reigned calm, while virtually defenseless Rome looked more and more like a tomb. Even the watch on the walls was conducted haphazardly. No one cared anymore. Vessus kept saving up his gold, and Totila was still hesitant to attack, remembering the heavy defeat of such attempts in the past. Finally, for Goths, climbed at night on one of the towers and found that the walls of the city were empty. The warriors went down to the Asinor Gate, broke it open, and reported it to their chiefs. Totila's army entered the city, with the king soon ordering trumpets to be blown so that the Romans might have the opportunity to flee through other gates or escape in churches. The Greek garrison, with Vessus and Conon, fled at the first sound of the trumpets, followed by those senators who still had horses. The Goths camped on the Lateran field, and in the morning, when they began to examine Rome, there were only 500 people left in the city, and this terrible testimony of a contemporary testifies to the monstrous loss in the population of the Eternal City. Goths killed about 100 people, soldiers and citizens, but the killings and pogroms and such desolation quickly ended. Bloodlust subsided in the silence of empty stone buildings, and the Goths moved to plunder the remains of former luxury. In the palace of the Caesars, the warriors found a pile of gold that Vessus had managed to accumulate. Patricians, hungry and tattered, Goths did not touch, except for the widow Boethius, Rusticana. Beggarly, begging for a piece of bread, she was nevertheless detested by the Goths as the initiator of the destruction of the statue to Theodoric. By destroying it, the woman avenged the death of her father and husband. Totila spared the unfortunate woman and generally ordered the killing and violence to stop. The battle for Rome was won, but not far away in Porto still stood much more dangerous forces Belisarius, so the war was far from over. Totila, who was at the zenith of his glory, intended to destroy the walls of Rome, turning it into a sheep pasture, and continue his heroic resistance, the success of which was no longer at all elusive. Whether Totila would hold Rome, whether he would drive the Greeks into the sea and take revenge on Sicily, we will learn in the sequel.